Starting to rain. Uh, Hello, I'm Daniel, and I'm going to be talking about the War of 1812. It's not one of the more studied wars, at least not in high school. It was where I was from. We didn't even check it out in the textbook. But reading this, it's kind of easy to see why. It's not a very focused war. You could argue that it didn't even start in 1812, that it started earlier with the conflict with the Native Americans. You could argue that it started a year after it was declared, because it didn't really heat up until then, what with the British invading and all. Or you could argue that it even started before that, because uh, the Napoleonic Wars were already going on in England and Prussia and Spain. Several others were already fighting the French. So really, 1812 was the year the U.S. entered into this conflict. And in 1812, it wasn't really a. There were battles. There were battles. It's just they weren't very successful. The U.S. tried to push into Canada, trying to take ground. The attacks were a disaster. They didn't get anywhere. They actually lost several other forts. They did take control of the Great Lakes, like Lake Ontario, which was a strategic advantage, and they did start to push west slightly. But all that pretty much went out the window when the British invaded in 1813, which resulted in the burning of Washington. Well, it, in their defense, it was pretty much revenge for the Americans burning another city in New England, if I'm not mistaken. Uh, Even after the date as the ceasefire in 1814, you could argue that the war still went on because it did. It didn't really end until a few weeks later. We had Commander Jackson who was still fighting the British, and the British were still fighting him until news came that there was a ceasefire weeks later. Uh, what did this war really leave us with? It showed us that the Americans could still hold their own as a country. Kind of. Their soldiers were very disorganized at first, which is ironic given the fact that they were the ones that wanted to get into the war, specifically Florida. Uh, but I digress. What this war did sort of show us was the Americans' willpower, you could say, but because even after their capital got burned, they were still fighting. I mean, fighting an almost unnecessary war because they could have. England didn't even really want to engage in conflict with them. It was too busy dealing with Napoleon. So the U.S. didn't even really have to declare war. They could have just focused on their own thing back home. But it did show that the U.S. could still hold its own against a superpower. And it also started to show the early signs of what later became known as Manifest Destiny. We saw the early slaughter of the Native Americans. Uh, did we also focus? No, that was earlier. The War of the Beavers was earlier. So I guess we're sort of left with a question of what did this war do for us? Not much other than sort of challenge President Jefferson. Was the conflict even necessary? You have to ask yourself, because the 1800s had several uh, conflicts that didn't need to happen. The war with Mexico, uh, this war, for example. You could even argue that the Spanish-American War wasn't even that necessary, but at least that one had a direct cause. Uh, this war, the War of 1812, didn't really. It was just sort of a sign that the U.S. wanted to expand as a country, and they did expand. It's probably the earliest signs of them actually going as far as they did and holding their own once again against their original parent country. This war isn't very focused on, not really in the media and today's culture. It's sort of that, like you could argue it's the teenage memory, the awkward state of the U.S. and they just wanted to grow or be just like daddy by taking more countries or more territories. Either way, it was a part of our history. It was something that I personally think we should focus more on, just just to see what the mindset was back then. Because it is interesting to see just how the American people sort of had a type of pride in this small union that they had created. And it is the war that gave us the national anthem. Yeah, this is where it came from. Uh, during a battle in the during a battle with a fort against the British, despite all the bombardments, the flag still stood, and a American soldier got inspired and wrote the Star Spangled Banner right about that time. And it took them long enough to turn it into to the national anthem, almost wow, a little over 100 years later, 1930. But it did give us that. It did give us that. Um, Daniel, and this has been the War of 1812.